Hi everyone and welcome back to ThursDev. I'm your host Luke, and today's topic is going to bring us briefly into the realm of UI design. Before we begin, I'd like to just preface by saying that this is not going to be an overly technical or in-depth exploration of UI design. I may venture into that territory in a future video, but for today, just consider this as a sort of a UI design 101 introductory video, and a little bit of a talk about the psychology of UI design. I am, by trade, a systems designer, and to that end am generally speaking more equipped to talk about the inner workings of game mechanics as they pertain to what must be programmed and how, but in my day, I've had some experience with working with UI and UX, which stands for user experience. In a small team environment like the one that we have at AlphaDog Games, the studio that I work at, the design team are on the hook to ensure that the project we're creating is both functional and entirely usable by our players. And to that end, we all have to have a strong grasp of the fundamentals of UI. If you're not familiar with the term, UI stands for user interface, and describes basically any part of the game that the player interacts or communicates with directly. While game mechanics drive the action and logic of the game, UI is the method by which the player can initiate and control that action, and through which vital information pertaining to that player interaction is relayed back to them. It encompasses things like control schemes, menus, and on-screen prompts like health gauges, and even screen space effects like the haze that appears when the character is injured in the average modern shooter. If the systems designer is the part of the design team that benefits most from a knowledge of programming, the UI designer is the one that is most in tune with the art department, as a strong knowledge of artistic as well as functional design is imperative. The topic of UI is an extremely broad one, and certainly far too large for me to cover in any one video, but I'd like to take a look at one common part of the UI that, as a player, is basically ubiquitous in games. Today we're going to talk just a little bit about the HUD, or heads-up display. A term borrowed from aviation, it refers to information relayed to the player on screen, in the case of a video game, that they can reference without requiring the player to look away from the action. Depending on the game, the HUD can be minimalist, like that found in the original Mega Man series, or it can be extremely complicated, like the various screens on strategy games and modern build and battle games on mobile. While contemporary video games, whenever possible, tend to attempt to lean in the direction of minimalism, there's always a balance that has to be struck between avoiding overwhelming the player with information and not giving them enough. When the game is simple, or the information that needs to be relayed to the player is limited, the game can often get away with very little. A life bar, maybe something to show the player what they currently have equipped. For each mechanic that the player should actively be able to reference, a corresponding HUD element usually becomes a necessity, and with it comes the need to find a place to put it on screen. This isn't to say that every element of the HUD needs to be on screen at every moment of gameplay, but regardless of whether things auto-hide, can be manually hidden, or whatever the context, space needs to be allotted, and potentially overlapping HUD elements need to be prioritized and dealt with. There are many schools of thought as to what makes for the best UI design, though most recent trends point towards UI that takes up as little screen space as possible, generally justified as much as possible to corners, with auto-hiding for anything that isn't immediately relevant. Screen space is seen as being at a premium, and for good reason, as the HUD, though designed to provide information to the player, also has the opposite effect of covering valuable areas of the screen that could contain useful in-game information for the player. When we do have a HUD, however, it's important to consider how most effectively to lay out our HUD, and what information should be prioritized. In the case of games that utilize touch controls, even more so, as the consideration of player interaction with the HUD, thereby obscuring the screen with their own hands and potentially needing to make awkward gestures, can further exacerbate any UI problems that already existed due to poor layout choices. When choosing where to place information on the game HUD, a surprisingly useful resource comes in the form of a diagram that was originally created for visual media design like websites and print, called the Gutenberg Diagram, which is by no means complicated, but nonetheless is something that anyone getting their start in game UI design may wish to familiarize themselves with. In principle, the Gutenberg diagram describes a human behavior known as reading gravity, which in essentia says that because of the way we're taught to read, we tend to place the most attention upon the upper left corner of any piece of media that's presented to us, and gradually our vision is pulled diagonally to the bottom right. Following this principle, we also tend to favor the right side of the media as we read, creating what is called a strong and weak fallow area in the upper right and lower left corners of the screen respectively. This creates groups of zones of visual priority, with the upper left being the most strong, lower right second, and then upper right and lower left becoming less and less powerful focal points. The Gutenberg diagram is often presented in tandem with another diagram called simply the Z diagram, which describes the shape of the human eye's travel across that piece of visual media. Although there are copious examples of games bucking this trend in favor of aesthetics, you're most commonly going to see games adhering to this pattern, whether intentional or not, when presenting information on a HUD. There's a certain amount of psychology involved in the selection and implementation of UI elements in this area, and I'd just like to make a few observations here, which you might find interesting and possibly useful. The most urgent information typically appears in the upper left of the screen, such as the health bar in Assassin's Creed, objective display in more linear objective-based games like Battlefield or Titanfall, and so on. Note that information that appears here, while imperative, is generally either small or sparse and doesn't update very often unless with direct relation to something that happens in-game. This is primarily because, with this focal point being as strong as it is, motion and events in this area of the screen tend to be more noticeable. In some cases, it can even provide distraction, which is why the space is used sparingly, if at all. The lower right corner of the screen is typically reserved for persistent elements that the user will want to reference on a regular basis: contextual controls, equipped weapons, ammunition, and so on. Because of the human eye's tendency to come to rest in this area, it's a comfortable spot for us to keep information that we don't need constantly, but will want to access regularly. The upper right area is another zone of moderate interest which the eyes tend to drift toward when in motion. Depending on the psychological goals of the game's design, this could be an ideal area for chat, with emphasizing social features like in a GTA Online, a minimap in a game that has both an open world but also distinct goals, or a persistent objective display, or in the case of Overwatch, team performance information. The lower left should be reserved for elements that the designer wants to de-emphasize when keeping persistent. Elements here are less obvious when updating, so either should be something that the player will actively be seeking out when they wish to make use of the information presented there, or should incorporate a large amount of visual juice, to use an industry colloquialism, to draw attention to it if the aesthetics of the corner outweigh the drawbacks of placing information there, as was most likely the thinking in Blizzard's UI design in Overwatch, which you'll note is supplemented by copious effects whenever updated. You'll typically find the minimap of an open world game or some incidental inventory in the lower left area. For considering centralized elements like the top or bottom center of the screen, the Z diagram once again is the proper place to reference. This is in part informed by our left to right, top to bottom reading culture in the Latin-based language-speaking West, and doesn't necessarily always hold true for cultures who are taught to consume their media otherwise and tend to favor styles that fit with their own media consumption sensibilities, which is why you might notice, if you're particularly sensitive to the shape of UI, that Japanese games, wherein reading is done top to bottom, right to left, the information on the screen may from time to time be presented in an unexpected place or in a distinctly Japanese manner. As with many parts of game development, cultural considerations are a huge part of design. Before I finish up today, I thought I'd touch once again very briefly on interactive HUD as in the case of strategy games, simulations and the like, as they present a unique challenge to the UI designer insofar as interactive elements are required to be integrated into the UI. This also stands true for a significant segment of mobile games as well, as they mimic mouse interface design in many ways. Depending in the case of mobile on whether a game is presented in portrait or landscape mode, the configuration will change to a certain extent, but you'll likely find that interactive buttons tend to stay on the bottom edge of the screen in all cases. This is once again a matter of the principles of reading gravity, as once again we tend to keep less intrusive objects on the bottom of the screen, where we'll see them but not necessarily need them passively, only referencing them when we specifically need them. There's also, of course, a practical consideration here, as with touchscreens, the hand will obscure the screen when interacting with anything at the top. Again, there are always going to be exceptions to any rule, and these are far from written in stone, but the psychology of UI design is a fascinating topic that's certainly worth your attention. Even if you aren't a designer, next time that you're playing a game, take a look at the on-screen HUD, and you might start to learn certain things about the UI design motivations of the creator of the game that you perhaps suspected but had less proof of. But for now, that's it for me. I'd like to thank you as always for joining me today, and I hope that you found this episode of ThursDev at least interesting, if not entertaining, and that you'll consider joining me again next time as well. I appreciate your dropping by, and if you aren't already a subscriber, go ahead and click the subscribe button below or in the upcoming end slate screen, as it both helps us as a channel and helps you find us in the future. Thank you for dropping by, and I do hope that you'll join me next time as well. Take care.